Good morning. It is great to see you. I want to thank David and Austin for sharing over the last couple weeks while I was on vacation. Appreciate them. Good to see the balcony crew. And if you're watching online, we're glad that you're watching. Now, for the last few weeks, we've been in a series called One Hit Wonders, in which we've been making reference to these musical artists that are famous for their one big hit. But today, I want to tell you about a guy who over the last 25 years has had a nearly unbelievable string of multiple number one hits. In fact, as a songwriter, he has the third most number one hits in history, only behind two members of the Beatles, Paul McCartney and John Lennon. In addition to his songwriting success, he's also tied for the most number one hits by a music producer with a total of 25 number ones to his credit, in addition to a couple hundred other songs that didn't make number one, but instead made the top 10. Because of his success, he's one of the most powerful people in the music industry, and he's worked with artists like Britney Spears, Pink, Usher, Katy Perry, Taylor Swift, Ariana Grande, The Weeknd, Coldplay, and most recently, the megastar Adele. His name is Max Martin, and I've got a picture of him that appeared in the Wall Street Journal in December of last year. Industry insiders often refer to him simply as the hit maker. But one of the more interesting things about Max Martin is that even though he's risen to the top of an industry that seems to value self-promotion more than musical ability, over the course of his career, he's worked extremely hard to develop and to maintain a certain level of anonymity. So even last year, when he broke the record for most number ones, he was profiled in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, the New York Times, The Guardian, and even Forbes magazine, and yet he refused to participate in any of the articles. In fact, according to his manager, he's only given one interview in the last 16 years. And yet, if you trace his impact and all the things he's been involved in the music industry, it's hard to imagine somebody who's had more involvement in successful projects than he has. One executive from a recording label described in this way. He said, Max Martin is the invisible hand that guides an artist to a place that would normally be unattainable. And then he added this. He said he sees his role as one of using his unique gifts to set other people up for sustained success. Now, I'll admit, most of the people that Max Martin has worked with are not the people that you will find on my playlist if you get in my car. And yet, you can't deny the impact he's had. And as soon as I heard that quote about it, I started thinking about all the different areas of our lives that would look different if that was the same mindset that we adopted. Just think about your day-to-day life. If you're a teacher, if you're a coach, if you're some kind of a supervisor at your job, think how different your daily life would look if that's the mindset that you adopted. Instead of always fighting for your place in the spotlight, you instead decided you were going to use your unique gifts to set the people around you up for sustained success. The more I thought about it, though, there was one area that I kept coming back to that a lot of us in this room already have a built-in opportunity to be that invisible hand that guides someone to a place that would otherwise be unattainable, and that's the area of parenting, or maybe in your case, grandparenting. So if you have your Bible with you or your phone, I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. And while you're turning there, I want to give you a little bit of a disclaimer. Now, as a father of 3 sons, I am deeply aware that I am not a perfect parent. In fact, I could tell you stories even from this past week about a trip to get an x-ray at Joe Brown's new clinic one night because I'm not a perfect parent. And so I don't come at this as an expert. I'm not here to say this is how I do it, so this is how you should do it. It's not that at all. This is an area where I'm trying to get better, just like some of you. But I was thinking about that this week, and one of my heroes, Wayne Smith, used to say it like this. He said, the woods would be silent if the only birds that sang were the birds that sang best. And what he meant by that is if you only talk about things that you don't struggle with, you're not going to have much left to talk about. So just know as we jump into this, I am not an expert. I am more of a fellow struggler. But one of the things that gives me hope is that when you read through the Bible and you read about some of the parents that are mentioned there, and especially in the Old Testament, you discover that there are very few positive examples. What you find are stories about real families with real problems, family dysfunction, relational struggles, sibling rivalry, struggles with addiction, and even violence. And the fact is that most of the people that you read about in the Bible were screw-ups just like the rest of us. And that makes me feel a little better. There is one example, though, found in Exodus chapter 2 about a husband and wife team who did this incredible job of setting their children up for long-term success. Of their 3 children, when it was all said and done, one of them became a well-known preacher, one of them became a famous worship leader, and the youngest one, the baby of the family, became a national leader. The question then is, how did they do that? And the answer is found in Exodus chapter 2. But to understand Exodus chapter 2, you first have to back up for just a minute to the end of Exodus chapter 1. If you go back to Genesis 37, there's this guy named Joseph. Many of you remember his story. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. And then over the next few years, through this nearly unbelievable set of circumstances, he winds up in Egypt, where he eventually becomes the prime minister of Egypt. He saves the Egyptian people from starvation through this lengthy famine. He also saves the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, including the brothers that had sold him off into slavery years earlier. And so for several years after that, everything goes well. Joseph's kind of a national hero. The Hebrew people are respected and admired among the Egyptians. But then eventually that Pharaoh dies, and a new Pharaoh ascends the throne who doesn't know anything about Joseph. He doesn't remember the story. So here's the way Exodus 1, verse 8 and 9 says. It says, "Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." Then you skip down to verse 22 of Exodus chapter 1, and here's his plan. "Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." Now, I know that sounds kind of unbelievable to us, but if you go back through ancient history, you'll discover that infanticide was often used as a means of achieving a military objective. And so Pharaoh wants to secure his own country, and as part of that, he's going to try to eliminate an entire generation of this potential enemy. Now, with that as a background, I want you to listen to how Exodus chapter 2 starts. Verse 1. "Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months." Now, a few chapters later, Exodus 6, we learn the names of these two people. The father's name is Amram, and the wife's name is Jochebed, and the son's name will eventually become Moses. But at this point in the story, they're just another seemingly insignificant couple who are part of this enslaved people group who find themselves in the impossible position of trying to care for a newborn child that the most powerful man on the face of the planet has ordered to be executed. Now, if you've ever had a child, then you know how difficult those first few months can be, even apart from any kind of a death threat. The sleepless nights, the feedings at odd hours, the dirty diapers, the sleepless nights, or at least that's what Jamie tells me. But you take all of that, all the stuff that goes with that, and then you add on to the fact that the government has just ordered the death of your child, and it's hard to imagine what that must have been like. Here they are living in a slave camp, trying to keep their baby quiet so nobody hears him. But even as they're up against what had to feel like this overwhelming challenge, Amram and Jochebed made 4 strategic moves that set Moses up to experience sustained success. So if you want to follow along with these, you can. You'll find an outline in your bulletin, or you can always use the FCC app. Here's the first thing that Amram and Jochebed provided for Moses. It was deep love and a chance at life. Now, on the surface of that, that would seem like that would go without saying, right? I mean, if you have a child, if you're a parent or grandparent, you know what it's like to hold that baby in your arms for the first time, and how at that moment there is a bond that's formed that's nearly unbreakable. It's a connection that's unlike any other connection in your life. And yet, when you live in a country that's seen 60 million abortions since 1973, you know that's not always a given. Now, thankfully, the number of abortions in our country has declined every year since 1991. And much of that can be directly attributed to the work of crisis pregnancy centers, just like the one here in our community. See, it's one thing to say that you're pro-life. It's something different to do the hard work of actually trying to support life. I've got a picture I want to show you. This is from the diaper drive that Austin and I took the diapers that we collected here over to the pregnancy center just across the road over here a couple weeks ago. When it was all said and done, we collected 349 dozen diapers. And the reason that's important is because those will be used by real people with real struggles right here in our own community. Now, I know by this point everybody's aware of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade and to send the abortion issue back to the states. And it's been interesting over the last 48 hours or so to see everybody's reaction to that and listen to the experts as they try to predict what's going to happen next. But here's one thing we know for certain. As important as it's been for people like us to partner with organizations like the Pregnancy Center in the past, it's going to be infinitely more important that we do an even better job in the future and provide everything we possibly can in terms of resources and encouragement to help people who need it right here in our own community. I was thinking this week about a story that I'm familiar with about a young woman who found herself trapped in an abusive relationship with a child on the way. And she and this man were married, and instead of going out and finding work like, responsible father would do, this guy who was a severe alcoholic and came from an entire family of severe alcoholics spent most of his time just sort of drifting from one house to the next. He would go stay with one drinking buddy for a few days, and he'd go somewhere else for a few days, and then he'd come home for a few days, and that was kind of his life. From my understanding, he was literally gone days at a time. And then whenever he did come home, he would take the little money that this woman had earned through her job, take what was left, go out and spend it on drugs and alcohol and all kinds of other illegal substances. It was at this point that this young woman found herself working 3 jobs at one time, and in 1983 earned a grand total of $4,000. And that was without any kind of assistance from her husband, any kind of assistance from anybody. Now, from one angle, you could say that to bring a child into that kind of chaotic situation would not only be unwise, but would be completely irresponsible. And back then, just like there are today, there were people who said, the best thing to do for all parties involved would be to terminate the pregnancy, get back on your feet, figure out what's next, get a little more solid foundation, and then worry about having a child. But I'll be honest with you. I'm glad she didn't do that. Because the lady in that story was my mom. And if she had done what some people wanted her to do, I would have never had a chance at life. Now, just for a second, let me say something to those of you who may have found yourself in a similarly difficult situation and made a different decision. As you read through the New Testament, there are a lot of verses that are helpful. But there is one verse in particular from 1 John chapter 1 that I think is particularly helpful. Here's what it says. If we confess our sins, he's faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. What's so amazing about this verse is if you look up the Greek, if you go to the original Greek and you look up that word that gets translated as all, do you know what it means? It literally means all. It means there's no dark stain on your record. There's nothing you've done. There's no decision that you've made that God can't forgive. There's no skeleton in your closet. In fact, as you keep reading, in Exodus chapter 2, in the very next section of the book, Moses murders an Egyptian in cold blood years later. And what does God do? He forgives him of that sin and he uses him to become a national leader. It's a beautiful example about how no matter how bad your sin is, God's grace is greater still. Now, here's the second thing that you see in this passage, and that's bold protection. When you get to verse 3, the time has come for Jochebed to make a really hard decision. It's interesting that Amram kind of disappears from the story at this point, and the reason for that is probably because he was a slave. He'd been called back into the workforce to work for Pharaoh. But whatever the situation was, it's Jochebed who's forced to make an unthinkable decision. Check out verse 3. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. Now, a lot of times we read these Old Testament stories, right? And we read them like they're fairy tales, and we just assume as soon as you open the story that everybody's going to live happily ever after. But what we read in Exodus chapter 2 is not a fairy tale. Instead, it's a carefully orchestrated, perfectly executed plan put together by a desperate mother. She knew where Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. She also knew when Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. So she made this little boat, little ark. She coated it with tar. She tested it on the water. Then at some point she probably placed Moses in there to test it out. Then when the day came, she went over, she hid that little boat in the weeds. And then in what had to have been one of the shrewdest moves of all time, she leaves his older sister Miriam, who's 10 or 11 at this time, there to watch what happens. And she tells her, hey, when Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe, you push that little basket out. You make sure she sees that baby. And then when she finds the baby, you come out and you say, hey, do you need somebody to nurse the baby? And when she says yes, you go and find me and bring me back, and we'll see what happens. Nothing random about this at all. This was all part of Jochebed's plan to protect her son. At this point in his life, there were two main threats to Moses. The first, of course, was Pharaoh, and that was his decree that every Hebrew baby boy be put to death. And from one angle, you could say, well, that was the biggest threat. I mean, obviously, that's a big one. But there were some other threats that were just as dangerous to Moses. I've got a picture I want to show you. This is a picture that was taken of the river where Moses was placed, the Nile River. It's infested with crocodiles. In fact, crocodiles were a constant threat to the ancient Egyptians. Historians tell us that 3 of the largest 4 crocodiles in history have been found in the river where Moses was placed, directly in the Nile River. So I did some reading about crocodiles this week. If you don't want to sleep at night, that's what you do. And do you know they're called ambush predators? And the people who study them say it's not at all unusual for a crocodile to spend literally weeks patiently waiting for the perfect opportunity to attack unsuspecting prey. So the praise there, they think everything is right with the world, and then out of nowhere, here comes this crocodile, clamps down its jaws and pulls them under. What happens is they're always there underneath the surface of the water, waiting for that perfect opportunity. That's why before Pharaoh's daughter, really before anybody in authority would step into the river, they had a whole team of servants. The Bible calls them attendants that would get in and just make sure there were no crocodiles in the area lying in wait. Because everybody knows that crocodiles are dangerous, right? Everybody knows they're potentially deadly. And if you're a parent or a grandparent, you need to know there are some crocodiles in the water that are waiting to drag your kids and your grandkids under. And we all know about the big ones, right? We all know what they are, and so we guard against them. Sexual abuse, drug addiction, porn addiction, teen pregnancy, violence. We do everything in our power to protect our kids from those things. But to be honest with you, there are some other crocodiles in the water that a lot of us think are harmless, that are no less dangerous. Let me give you an example. If you're here this morning and you're at or above the age of 30, you need to know that the world that you grew up in is not the same world that your kids and grandkids live in. Might as well be on two different planets. I noticed this week, I got home from vacation, I sit down in my chair, was flipping through some channels, and on the stream service that we use that provides our television at home, they had a list of about 25 different TV shows that are being highlighted this month because of Pride Month that are focused on homosexuality, transgenderism, and they had a show about kids that are 6 and 7 years old that have decided they're transgender and are now taking hormone blockers. Right there on your television. One of the big controversies of the last month, you've been paying attention, has been the inclusion of a same-sex couple in the new installment in the popular Toy Story series. They hear that and you say, it's just a TV show. I mean, it's just a goofy kids movie. I mean, what difference could that make? Truth is, it can make a lot of difference. How about this? Every study that's come out, without exception, in the last 10 years has linked social media use to increasing instances of clinical depression, especially in teens and preteens. And yet a recent study released by the company that owns Facebook found that the average middle school and high school student spends anywhere from 3 to 9 hours a day on some kind of social media platform. Facebook, Snapchat, Discord, TikTok, WeChat, or one of the dozens of others. Or how about this? The American Psychological Association, at the end of last year, they released a multi-year study that found that using the social media platform Instagram has been definitively linked to negative psychological outcomes, including depression, social anxiety, body image concerns, and measurable decreases in self-esteem. Now here's what happens. We hear all that, and we think to ourselves, man, that is bad. And then what do? We go home, we load our kids up with smartphones and iPads and laptops, and we leave them alone for 3 to 9 hours a day to fend for themselves. And the whole time, there are these crocodiles that are just under the surface of the water that want to drag them under. Here's the deal. If you want to set your children up for sustained success, somewhere along the way, you're going to have to make some bold moves, and maybe some unpopular moves. Maybe just like there are some places you don't let them go, and some people you don't let them hang out with, maybe there are some shows you shouldn't let them watch and some apps that you shouldn't let them download. And it's not that you just have a responsibility to protect them from other people. You have a responsibility to protect them from themselves. 1 Peter 5, the Apostle Peter said it this way. He said, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And being alert and of sober mind means that you realize that there are some lions that are prowling around. There are some crocodiles that are swimming in the water that will do anything they can to ruin your kid's life. Now here's the third thing. You see an example of Amram and Jochebed, and that's that they provided Moses with a spiritual foundation. You go back to verse 1 of this passage. The very first thing that you learn about Amram and Jochebed is that they were members of the tribe of Levi. The reason that's important is because that was the priestly tribe. That was a line of spiritual leaders. And so the very first thing that Exodus 2 tells us is these people came from a line of spiritual leaders. And what's so incredible about that is that even though Moses had been adopted into Pharaoh's family, God worked behind the scenes to create a scenario in which Moses' birth mother was paid to care for him. It's kind of the original version of paid parental leave. The only problem is that she knows she has a very limited, very narrow window of time in which to teach him about his spiritual heritage, because at some point he's going to have to go back and live with Pharaoh's daughter. So from the moment she brings him home to start caring for him, she knows that the clock is ticking. Most scholars believe that Jochebed had somewhere between 5 and maybe up to 8 years to lay this foundation that would carry Moses through the rest of his life. And that was it. I mean, there was not going to be any more time after that. Moses was going to be on his own, and it would be up to him which direction he would go. Now, when you think about it, 5 to 8 years doesn't seem like a whole lot of time. But if you're a parent, you really do have a very limited amount of time in which to lay a spiritual foundation for your children. To be clear, it is a much shorter amount of time than most of us think. Just listen to these statistics. According to a recent study by the Barna Group, 94% of people, listen to this, 94% of people who decide to become a Christian do so before the age of 16. Of that number, 85% of them do so between the ages of 4 and 14. Researchers call it the 414 window. Now, with that in mind, let me just show you what the average week looks like for most kids who live in that 4 to 14 window. I tried to break it down for you like this. If 1 week equals 168 hours, let's assume that your child sleeps 8 hours a night. That's going to take up 56 of those 168 hours. Then when school is in session, they're going to spend somewhere around 35 hours a week at school, and that doesn't count, the time getting ready and anything after school that they might have. Then if they're involved in some sort of sport or some sort of after-school activity, that's another 30 hours probably at the minimum. And if you add in all the travel time, it's probably more than that. Then you've got what I just called me time. That's what they, scrolling Facebook, looking at Instagram, watching TV, playing games, whatever it is your kid or grandkid likes to do, that's the time they do it in. Now, let's add church into that equation. Go to the next slide. For most people, and this is a big assumption. This is assuming that when you come to church, you come to both Sunday school and the worship service, or you come to the worship service and Wednesday night, or some combination of those things. At best, you're getting about 2 hours a week, and that's if you come, to 2 of the 3 things, and that's also assuming that you come every weekend and never miss. I'll just leave that there, but that's... So let's assume at best you get to come to church 2 hours a week. For some people, that's going to be 8 hours a month. For others, it's closer to 2 or 3 hours a month. But at best, here's what this means, if this is accurate. At best, that means that 1% of your time is spent laying a spiritual foundation in the average week. 1%. And 99% is spent on other stuff that every single person would say, boy, that's really not that important. Think about that. So here's the point. What we do at church is really important. Don't get me wrong. And we're going to do everything we can to partner with you. But the truth is that what happens here is not nearly enough. What happens at home will do more to determine the spiritual direction your children choose than anything we can do here. I think that's why years later, when Moses sat down to write the book of Deuteronomy, David read it for it earlier. Here's what he says. These commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at church. No, talk about them when you sit at home. And when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them as foreheads on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. You notice of all the things he talks about there, all of those are things that happen at home, because home is where this happens best. Now here's the last thing. If you want your children to experience sustained success, at some point you have to be willing to bless them and release them. Check out what happens in verse 10. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. It's hard to imagine what that moment must have been like, but some of you have been there. Some of you know what it's like to watch your child get on a plane, or to watch the taillights of the U-Haul as it drives away, as your child moves across the country or maybe across the globe. And when that moment comes, the only thing that's really going to matter is, did you do your best? Did you love them deeply? Did you do your best to protect them? Did you do the hard work of laying a spiritual foundation? That's really what it comes down to. And thankfully in this moment, Jochebed could walk away knowing that she had done her best. I mean, if you know Moses' story, you know that he later became known as a son of Pharaoh. He was fully adopted member of the family, which meant he had the best of everything. He lived in the best houses. He ate the best food. He went to the best schools. He had the world at his fingertips. But then if you know the rest of the story, you know eventually he became his own man. He said no to the pleasures of Egypt. He confronted Pharaoh, and then he led the Hebrew people out of Egyptian slavery and toward the promised land. And all of that happened because of what happened at home. Throughout his life, it was like there was this invisible hand that kept guiding him to a place that would normally have been unattainable. I have another picture to show you. As I was reading this week about the music producer Max Martin, there were two things that stood out to me. The first is that he wrote nearly all of the songs that made Taylor Swift famous, which is strange when you consider that she's known for having these breakup songs, written from the perspective of a young woman. All of those were actually written by a 50-year-old guy from Sweden. So I don't know what that does for you, but I thought that was weird. Now, the second thing, though, is that whenever he produces an album, he uses a little-known method called verbal comping. And here's what this means. When they go into the studio to record the vocals for a new song, he will have the artist sing through each word of the song one at a time up to 150 times. So rather than singing the entire song through, they'll just sing the same word over and over and over again up to 150 times. Then over a period of weeks, he locks himself in the studio. He goes back and he listens to every single syllable that was recorded multiple times. Then he takes the best possible version of each syllable and pieces them together to create the strongest possible vocal performance. So, for example, one word in the song, in the version that you hear, might have been taken from 4 different versions. Like one syllable of each word is put together to create the final product. So, for example, when Max Martin went to produce the final version of Taylor Swift's hit song, Shake It Off, he took different syllables from 113 different versions of that song to piece together what became the final version. That's why if you ever go to a concert, it doesn't sound anything like what you hear on the radio, because that version is completely different. In his view, the job of a producer is to keep working until every syllable of the song is perfect. That's why he's called the hit maker. Now, as a music producer, Max Martin knows he can take as long as he needs and he can record as many versions as he wants to get it right. But as a parent, you don't get that opportunity. You get one shot. And even then, it's a very limited, narrow shot. was thinking about this week. I thought, well, I got 3 sons, so that means I've got 3 chances. But that's not true. I've got 1 chance 3 times. Because that's how it works. Now, I want you to stand with me. Whenever you talk about something like this, there are normally 2 common responses. Some people hear this and they think to themselves, you know what, I've got to do a better job. And so they walk away with a fresh commitment to make the most of whatever time they have left with their kids and their grandkids. There are other people, though, who hear all this and they're immediately confronted with an overwhelming sense of regret because they know they didn't do the best they could when it came to raising their kids. One of the things that's so encouraging about this story is if you keep reading through Exodus, you'll discover that even though Amram and Jochebed really did do a great job, even their kids had struggles. I mean, Moses killed a guy. Aaron struggled with idolatry. I mean, so even though it's a positive example, it is another reminder that there are no perfect families. And nobody does this perfectly. And so sometimes all you can do is just say you're sorry and start over. So as we close today, we're going to sing a couple of final songs as we always do. And if you're here and you want to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, you're unsure what your next step should be, David and I would love to talk with you. All you need to do is come up front, meet us on this front row, and we'll be glad to talk with you.